welcome to some new attendees since this morning, and we had a fantastic session, and no doubt the conversation will continue after this final one, so we'll be rolling it up at the end as well, and that will be my job as final chair. So I'm delighted to introduce the final panel. I do have some unfortunate news, which is that Reinier de Graaf's plane was cancelled. So we have two wonderful presentations, and we are going to do a silent presentation of Reinier's PDF, because it's really quite fascinating, and I think we'll still get a lot out of it. And also I think that there's some fantastic slides that we can take through to the end in terms of a discussion. So Reinier is very disappointed not to be here. He's done a very special and focused presentation, so that's disappointing, but not too disappointing, because we have two amazing speakers. And I'm going to first just introduce the theme of the final panel, and also then introduce our first speaker. So this is final panel's Architects as Workers. Architects are workers. The work that architects do, whether aesthetic, technical, theoretical, social or administrative, is a form of labour, yet rarely framed in this way. Architects rarely participate in unions or the organisation of workers' rights. They are highly susceptible to exploitation in the workplace, individually by employers or collectively through competition and procurement systems. Ethical codes for architecture exist in a reductive form at professional level, but even these are often disregarded at a more personal level, in the workplace or in the field of design production. So our final panel will conclude with a conversation which brings the dilemmas of labour to the profession's own doorstep, and I think that that's been a recurrent theme that we've started to pick up on throughout, of course. Our first speaker, who'll give us an extended lecture, is Peggy Deamer. Peggy is a professor at Yale and also a member of the founding member of the architecture lobby. She's an architect practicing in New York and has been the editor of Architecture and Capitalism, 1845 to the present, and the book that is much cited in this symposium, The Architect as Worker, Immaterial Labour, the Creative Class and the Politics of Design. She's the co-editor with Phil Bernstein of Building in the Future and BIM in Academia. She's the founding member of the architecture lobby, through which she explores the relationship between subjectivity, design and labour in the current economy. So do welcome Peggy to the stage.
Just to say, it's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from Mel and from the school. I'm also delighted to be here with the Contra Condutas group. I was part of the Brazil, conference around that, and that was part of the pleasure for me. And so to be back here in that context feels very kind of complete. I also should say thank you to Shaban, who, again, where are you? It was been said before, but one does really recognize all the work that goes into making something like this happen smoothly, and so it's a real pleasure. I also should say thank you to Jeremy Till, who recently came to a conference at Yale that I organized around very similar themes, but I think in some way he's a real leading voice for another kind of discipline and another kind of education and another kind of profession. So I feel like I'm in a happy crowd here, and I appreciate it. So just to say something about this slide, in some way, everything that I maybe want to talk about is embedded in this. And this was at protests that happened with the inauguration of President Trump. But and this was not a lobby member, but the lobby member took this photograph as Pay Your Architect. But what's interesting here is one, that pay matters, and but it also is a question of who's being addressed here. So in some way, it's being addressed to the public. The public should know, pay your architect. It's being addressed to Trump, for sure, who did not pay his architect. And in some way, it is also a call to architects to pay their architects, to pay their staff. But in some way, it also speaks to a larger issue of what it means to be an architect in heightened neoliberalism, which is this context. So anyway, I'm hoping that lays out some of the things that I'm interested in. So the talk will be in 2 parts, and the first will be the architect as worker. The second part will be the worker as activist. The architect as worker, I feel like the prior session, the 3 talks, covered everything that I want to talk about in the work. And so I kind of, if we put those 3 talks and put them in a blender, it will kind of come out to be this. And so you're going to have to be, I think, patient with what will feel repetitious at this point. But anyway, it makes a point that's important to me. But I also want to acknowledge how great those 3 talks were, and in some way they're much more detailed around the things that they're obsessive about and are researching in a probably more complete fashion than this will be demonstrating. So anyway, the architect as worker, there are 4 parts to this talk. We do work, not just art. We are knowledge workers, not object producers. We are aligned with other types of workers, and we must reflect the society that we work for. Each of these 4 parts has 3 sub-themes. So you'll get it that there are 3. There are 12 points that I'm going to make, and I'll go through them fairly quickly again, because I think I'm repeating points that were made earlier. But to align them in this way, hopefully make some relationships that matter to me and to the architecture lobby clear to you. So we do work, not just art. The first sub-theme is identifying our work as work. Does not mean that it is not fun, creative, and rewarding. This partly comes from my work on utopian societies, and if you know that literature, there really are 2 different approaches to work that utopian societies have, and one is cut the workday short so that you can have leisure time, and the other is have your work actually be creative, fun, and fabulous. I am definitely of that second sort. That work is something that is subjectively satisfying if it's done in the right way. So I'm trying to identify the fact that our work as architects should be seen as fun, not because it's creative, but because work done in the right way is itself something that is fulfilling and rewarding. We see a picture here of the utopian society, the Shakers. The Shakers were a celibate society, and all of their utopianism went into their products that they made. And I'm hoping that some of you are familiar with the beauty of those products. But the point was that work was in every way fulfilling. Part of it is, and just to bring this into a larger kind of political context, if you own the means of production, the work itself will be creative and satisfying, and that's what they exemplified. So then the corollary to this, the second sub-theme of we do work, not just art, is creativity is still work, and artists recognize this more than architects. I maybe don't need to elaborate on this, but it is interesting to me that when I talk about architectural work or labor, one of the things that I often hear is like, oh, we don't do work, we don't labor, we do art. And so then it's interesting to me that if that is the case, the people who really, really do art, which is the artists, recognize that what they do is work. And are much more politically astute about that. I think in some way because they know the term starving artists, and so in some way they embrace that and fight that and have to politicize that. So, on the one hand, we're seeing a union for artists in England, but we're also seeing the work of Maureen Connor, who also I think was part of the work with Who Builds Your Architecture. And she's an interesting artist because most of her work, her artwork, is about the nature of work. And so this is one of her projects called Casual Friday. But just to say, the artists themselves are taking work on as a content more and more. Particularly those artists who are related or who are working in the rubric of relational aesthetics. So then the third subcategory here, we are part of the economy, and until we understand this and embrace it, we will not be in a position of power. Just to say, if we don't understand our work as labor, we basically don't understand the economy. And if, as a practice, one hasn't incorporated the financial realities of labor within your practice, you don't have a business plan. And if you don't have a business plan, you basically don't have any place at the table of power. So labor is a large part of getting ourselves into that position of power. So the second main category, we are knowledge workers, not object producers. And then the first subcategory of that is we do immaterial work. The buildings we produce are the tip of the iceberg. So there are a number of aspects to this. One is recognizing for ourselves that we know so much before we actually come to the design of a project, whether it is about precedents, whether it's about community, whether it's about real estate, whether it's about materials, whether it's about the environment, whether it's about procurement, whether it's about our clients' psychology. We know so much, and we tend not in any way to make that clear to the public or to our clients, and that's part of our tragedy. But it also, in some way, comes with a different definition of design, and I think, Kanabara, you were talking about this, but I think this has been a theme that has been brought up earlier. What do we mean by design? A problem-defining, problem-solving, information structuring activity that, on the basis of understood goals, conditions, and rules, defines a specific course of action. So in some way, if we think about design in that larger sense, and think about, again, is the other term that Shimi brought up is abstract labor. All of these things have to do with a different notion of design that is part of our value. So the second subcategory here, producing only buildings is piecework, the worst form of labor. The quote here by Marx, I probably don't have to read it, but basically the essence of it is that if you think in piecework that you can actually get a profit by doing more of it more and do it quicker, the market or the manager or the owner will recognize very quickly to change the price of what's being done. And so it's the most easily manipulated form of labor. I want to emphasize that going to seeing your work as going from project to project is piecework. It's big piece, but it's piecework. And basically, if you assume that your business plan is to wait for that phone call to get that new piecework, you also don't have a business plan. But it also is part of an industry that is particularly unfortunate, which is that if you think of it as piecework and operate as piecework, you hire up for the piece that you've got and you fire down when you don't have the project, which means that there's no ongoing knowledge base within the office structure itself, and then I think within the larger discipline as an approach to work. So the third subcategory here, we need to leverage our long-term knowledge of and care for the environment. So what we're seeing here are two projects from Kieran Timberlake. Kieran Timberlake, in many ways, I think, are a model for a kind of practice that transcends client-driven practice. But what we see here with the app that they developed, which is Tally, which is that while you're designing, you actually understand the carbon footprint as you go. And so it's not after the whole design is done and then you go through an analysis of what it is. You while you're calling up materials and calling up processes and calling up industry that will satisfy that, you know what the carbon footprint is. And then on the other end, this is a gizmo that they're devising that you put into the buildings to monitor the energy consumption of the building, so that you can actually then begin to determine whether the claims for the environmental operations of the building are what you claim them to be. So pre-design, post-design, it's a longer-term understanding of what our obligations are to both the client and the environment together. The third major category, we are aligned with other types of workers. And the first subcategory, we are part of a larger team of knowledge producers, contractors, engineers, owners, financial analysts, lawyers, software producers, et cetera, et cetera. Indeed, we are all designers. So again, this connects to the point that I was making earlier about a larger definition of design that isn't only about object production, but also includes many more people under that definition of design. The image here is of everybody who was involved in the design and production of Federation Square in Melbourne. This is one of my favorite slides ever because it shows the community of workers that all contribute to a pretty fabulous public space and a building. So, second subcategory. The worker-manager distinction is no longer the primary operative dialectic. Who does and does not control money is. I bring this up because when we're talking about other types of workers, aligning ourselves with other type of workers, we also should realize that we're talking about that within the office itself. And when we tend to talk about the architect, I think we all kind of go to the image of the firm owner. Yeah, that's the architect, but the reality is that the number of people who are actually the firm owners in relationship to the staff is very small, and most of the people are architects or architectural designers who are employees and not employers. And so we want to talk about that relationship in some way. So when I bring this up, there are kind of two aspects of it. One is, and I think this was brought up earlier, that we do work in a kind of manner that makes the employee very friendly and close to the employer, such that the worker-manager distinction is very, very hard to determine. I'm my friend, we're sitting there, we're charretting together, we're all making the project together, we're one big happy family, you know, but that masks a point that there is truly a structural division. And it's one that Zizek makes, you know, which is the best thing that an employer can do is remind the employees that they're the employers and there's the employees and there is a difference. And that way you actually know what you can be talking about in a fairly straightforward, transparent fashion. But having said that, while trying to emphasize that there is that structural difference, when one talks about labor, or when one talks about organizing labor, I think the first thing that architects maybe go to is like, ooh, no, I don't want to set up in any way an antagonistic relationship between staff and firm owners. Don't want to do that. And so the question is then, how do you actually in some way recognize that difference but don't make it antagonistic? You make it transparent but not antagonistic, because in the end, what architects need to face, what all workers need to face, is the difference between who does and who does not control the money, that's the bigger difference. And of course, then this relates to the issues that come up with Occupy Wall Street, and the difference of the 99% to the 1%. So in some way, this is a claim for a much larger anti-capitalistic project that's embedded in the one that we experience in the architect's office. The third subcategory of this one is, this is a socio-political position, Workers of the World Unite. I really am at this point really indebted to Who Builds Your Architecture for making me very aware, but I think all of us aware of the fact that our obligation to identify with the construction workers, and that's one of the huge issues that we're all struggling with right now. We're certainly not going to be empathetic if we do not identify ourselves as workers. If we're above work and there are working, we shouldn't be surprised that that the majority of architects don't think of it as their quote-unquote issue. There are other things I'm going to go into later about that, but certainly the identification as worker is a socio-political position that goes beyond architecture. Okay, the fourth major category, we must reflect the society we work for, and the first subcategory, we aren't exceptional geniuses, no star architects. In some way, this is a twofold plea. One is against star architects. The other is a certain notion of exceptionalism. I think architects tend to think of themselves as exceptional, and the star system is merely a symbol of a larger feeling of exceptionalism, such that we are the exception to the rule, or that we give our gifts to society as if we're not in society, as if we don't model society in and of itself. But this is, just to say, this is an op-ed that I wrote after there was a long article exposing Calatrava's overindulgence in the new transit station at the 9/11 site, 10 years overdue, 100% over budget. So anyway, there was an article, talking about that, and I knew that the response from the architects would be, but this, he's a genius, this is how we get great works of art, this is how we get the Louvre, and this is how we get all these great things. But the point that I wanted to make is that it's not that we need geniuses to do good things. It's like the genius has never ever been an accurate description of how it is that we work. It's never been the case, and it's a myth, and it's a myth that that certain architects like to perpetuate. I like to tell the story that when there was a discussion at Yale, and it was Frank Gehry and Peter Eisenman, and someone said to Frank, it's like, how do you feel about the term star architect? And he was just outraged. And he and Peter said, if there were not star architects, architects would not be in the newspaper. That's what they're in. And it's kind of like, some of you are perpetuating that being the case. So anyways, to get rid of that myth altogether. So I also want to emphasize that if it's never ever been the case, that there are individual geniuses who do this thing, particularly now when we have the technology that not only allows collaboration, but in some way demands collaboration, it's really, really pathetic to think about this as a model for how we get good buildings out in the world. Second subcategory, gender equality is essential, and it's not enough. I just grabbed this from the website of CASE, which is an architecture group that actually no longer exists. They've been absorbed into WeWork, which is its own interesting story. But I took it because you can kind of get a sense of a somewhat democratic office that seems to be fairly outstanding in terms of gender equality, better than most. But in terms of racial diversity or age diversity, or I would suggest socioeconomic diversity, it's not there. And then last, for this category, and last of the 12 if you've been counting, we can't give our architects a better world if we don't model, experience, or practice it ourselves. And this is something that I'm thinking more and more about, which is, again, if we think that if we're given the right projects, going to give better public spaces, better housing, even better homes, better places to work, because we know what a better world is like. It's like, how can we think that if our daily life of going to work in a sexist, racist, unpaying situation, if our daily life does not in any way experience a better world? How are we truly supposed to understand what a better world is like? Part of this, again, just to go back to this idea of the kind of exceptions, like we're above here and we know what we can give the world, and here we are, our gifts, as if we're not in some way in a position to model that society ourselves. And so it's really like, let's clean up our own home before we begin to go out into the world and say, this is how you should do it. This is the second part of the talk, this will talk about the worker, the architectural worker as activist, and this will really go into the work of the architecture lobby. I do have to say, none of this work is paid for, so in some way this is a shitty model for the thing. It's all volunteer, but there we are. Anyway, the Architecture Lobby is an organization of architectural workers advocating for the value of architecture in the general public and for architectural work within the discipline. And these are our demands. We are precarious workers, these are our demands. I feel like I don't want to read all these, and in some way they incorporate many of the things I've already identified in the architect as worker. But this manifesto is something that was very instrumental in organizing conversations, not just that we're putting out there in the world, but amongst ourselves. And these manifesto points are still being debated, but in some way they're a go-to point for many of our discussions. So I want to say just internally and externally they're important. And then this is just a diagram of how the organization works. We have chapters in different cities and in different schools. Those chapters speak to each other. If there's a project that they're working on together collaboratively, but all of those different chapters also will work through our organizing committee. And the organizing committee is made up of somebody who manages the organization, a secretary, a financial manager, and then somebody who's the content coordinator, me, and somebody who's the design coordinator, and somebody who's the research coordinator. And so it's kind of rhizomatic, but mildly centralized as well. In going through the worker as activists, I'm going to talk about three different types of things that we do. One is theory work. Most of that theory work is around what I would call institutional critique. Performance, which I align with kind of ideological critique, and then practice, which is certain actions that we do that are more practical in nature. So for the first theory, institutional critique, is work that is on antitrust laws, and this came up because when a fellow lobby member and I went down to the AIA National Committee in Washington, D.C., and I think they were humoring us by actually letting us meet with them, the lawyer, the CEO, the head of design projects. They knew that we were kind of coming down with certain questions about why the AIA wasn't more effective. Anyway, the long and short of it was that the reason I said that they were sympathetic to the things that we were saying. Why can't we discuss fees? Why can't we talk about wages? Why can't we talk about better labor practices? Was that antitrust laws, and that the AIA had been visited with 2 consent decrees in 1972 and 1990 with really draconian effects. And any discussion of fees and any discussion of wages was going to bring a 3rd consent decree and bring the Department of Justice against them, which is to say it's collusion to either talk about fees or talk about wages at all, which is why they're not going to touch it. And I will just say that it is, it is the case that the Department of Justice is very, very strong about this. And you can read the bottom of this. It's not just that the AIA, as a professional organization, will have the Justice Department come down on it. 2 architects, if the Justice Department gets winds of it, 2 architects who are in any way colluding about anything like, I won't do this competition if you don't do this competition. As you see, that's 10 years in jail and $10,000 fine. Or if we agree to not go after a job unless we both agreeing that we want 18% collusion, 10 years in jail, $10,000 fine. So their objection has weight behind it. So anyway, because of this, I thought that somehow, we all know what doctors get, we all know what lawyers get, we all know what real estate agents get. How is it that somehow realtors know the 7% and somehow all the lawyers will, for example, give all of their first year associates the same amount of money. It's all known, and how did that happen? So I thought, well, I want to do a study of antitrust laws to see whether architects or the AIA is interpreting them with more paranoia than the other disciplines. In the end, that is not the case. What is the case is that these other industries have much more power than we do, and there are ways to get around those antitrust laws, and these are some of them. There's a third-party survey that invites implicit collusion, and this is actually how all the lawyers know what they're going to pay their first-year interns, which is a third party that's not part of the industry put a descriptive paper saying what certain law firms in New York and Washington, D.C. are paying their first-year associates, and as soon as it was described, everyone went to the top, and that was it. So that's implicit, which is collusion. No one said, let's do this, but they do. So blah, blah, blah. The other is legislation. So the only way to get around antitrust law is to change the laws, which means legislation. And that means that you need to have strong lobbies to change legislation. Another way, which architects do not, another one is unions. Unions are exempt from antitrust laws. And then another one, which I'll talk more about, is deprofessionalization, which is to not be a profession. So that's one kind of institutional critique that's gone on. Another one came out of this work, this paper that we did in response to AIA values, and this was kind of referred to in Who Built Your Architects talk about the particular motivation that came to many of us with Trump's election, and particularly the CEO of the AIA saying, the next day after Trump was elected, the AIA and its 89,000 members stand to work with you, Trump. And that was a horrible way of implicating us architects, whether we're members of the AIA or not. And so we wrote a paper in response to that had a number of different things, and I won't go through it, but this is also where the idea of competition, which again, antitrust laws are all about making sure that we do competition, is not only embedded in us as handed down from the Department of Justice and the capitalism which it serves, but I think comes on to a profession that is particularly competitive and egotistic in and of itself, around that notion of the lone genius, and so I think we're particularly susceptible to that. But also, and this is kind of, I don't know if we're, here we are. What happened is the AIA put as keynote speakers at one of their national conventions 2 firms that could prove how much more work you could do for less money for your client. So that doesn't seem to be good advocacy for how we actually might get more value for ourselves. And that's a subliminal assumption about competition, which is a sure way to get down to the bottom. But the other is, in that paper, this is where we talk more fully about deprofessionalization. And deprofessionalization does not mean we don't have certificates of competency. The difference between deprofessionalization and certificates of competency is that certificates of competency are run by the industry itself and not by the state. And so the industry makes its own standard. But the idea of deprofessionalization, what's attractive to me about that, is that instead of a potential client or a public, or potential client's hearing is like, oh, and you should hire an architect. It's like, architect, we know what that means. Egotistical, wants to do their vision, doesn't want to listen to me, will make it more expensive, and will probably leak. This is what architect means. So let's just get rid of that. Don't do that, don't have that particular room, and actually have a situation where people will come to us, whether we're certified at a certain levels, because part of the certification could happen at different levels, certain kind of competency that you have after 3 years in the profession, another after you have 10, is that you actually identify what your knowledge base is, and you actually have to describe it as opposed to getting into the category of expensive, egotistic, and whatever. And I could go on and on about this, but it does indicate here professionalism is a construct of liberal capitalism, and that construct had 3 simultaneous goals: to ensure a guiding elite knowledge sector, to, ironically at the same time, harken back to pre-capitalist ideals of craftsmanship, universal protection of social fabric, and noblesse oblige. And then thirdly, to offer conventions of standardization, scientific and cognitive rationality, and a progressive division of labor. All of these, which are conditions that I think are no longer relevant for our particular time or economy. I will just say, deprofessionalization is something that I'm fairly strong about, and it does not represent everybody in the lobby. So this becomes a part of our conversation that I think in some way characterizes what the lobby does. We talk about things, we don't always agree. So this then leads to another part of kind of institutional critique, which is professionalism itself. And I wasn't going to talk about this, but because of conversations that came up yesterday, I thought I would put this in here, which is really a reminder that Robert Gutman has given us a fairly good description about why architecture is not like law and medicine. And you can see the figures here, 10 years out, the difference between pay of 10 years out between lawyers, doctors, and architects. Their services, which is as architects, their services, lawyers and doctors aren't dispensable as ours are. Architectural work is not, as is theirs, transactional work. It depends on projects that we need to seek out. The right to dispense legal and medical services is restricted to members of the legal and medical profession, while architects' right to practice, design, and supervise building construction must be shared. In most states, civil engineers are permitted by statute to perform most of the same services. Doctors and lawyers order those who execute their work, which is nurses, paralegals, etc., around, but we don't order the builders around. Our decisions and roles are negotiated. The demand of architectural services is a function of the market demand for buildings, and architects have not freed themselves from dependence on the construction industry that goes up and down with the economy. And then I like this one, architectural offices, from partners to architectural employees, order production according to the principle of hierarchy. Indeed, hierarchies are often illogical. Law and medicine operate under the principle of collegiality, in which all lawyers and physicians are regarded as equals, possessing equal rights to contribute to decision making. In architectural firms, people with equivalent training and credentials frequently take their work orders from fellow professionals whose training is no different. Put it another way, one of the striking features of architectural work is that so much relatively tedious, humdrum work is done by persons with full architectural credentials. Anyway, what was interesting to me then when we began to think more about professionalism itself is the fifth category of this one, which is we're too dependent on construction. We haven't disengaged ourselves from that, and consequently on the ups and downs of the economy. And our response is basically twofold. It's kind of like, well, okay, you can bypass that in two ways. And one is not to be client-driven, not to wait for that construction project to come your way. And one way to do that is to think about research and development, entrepreneurialism, as Shumi was talking about it, create your own work. And again, I'm using as an example here the app that Karen Timberlake developed, and now they sell that, as their own product. And then the work here of the living, their hi-fi project, which was at PS1, which is built of this mushroom material that basically means that this will be biodegradable when it's done. So this is another kind of production that is not client-driven and hence disengages from that dependence on the construction industry. But the other one, and it's actually the one that I'm most interested in, is the one where you'll get closer relationships with construction. And I'm sure most of you have seen diagrams like this before. These come from SHOP. The kind of old model of the kind of enclaves of the client being separate from the architect, being separate from the construction industry, all of them having their own consultants and bifurcated. And then the possibility with BIM and sharing a model of having them talk through that model, and then finally to a different plan, a different contractual plan altogether, integrated project delivery, where those silos are completely broken down and everybody works together with shared risk and shared reward. So that I get interested in that model. And so one could go farther than that. And so then the next institutional work is around contracts, because I was interested in how it is that the contracts are set up to have such antagonistic relationships between the owner, the contractor, and the architect. And this came from a paper we did recently. But just to go into this slightly, what we're seeing here is the standard design build contract. And it's actually, I hope you all noticed, and I was bringing this point up yesterday, and it was kind of brought up today. It's not just that there are these three silos, it's that there is a contract between the owner and the architect, and there is a contract between the owner and the contractor, but there is no contract between the architect and the contractor. And I've always been we're so dependent on the contractor. That relationship is so important. Why can't we have a direct relationship with them? But of course, one reason we don't is in the design bid, which is we design and then it goes out to bid, and you don't even know who the contractor is going to be, and then the contractor is going to be somebody that the owner chooses, and it's probably the cheapest one. And so already that you've been beaten down fee-wise, and they're beaten down fee-wise, and you're all kind of looking at each other, the contractor and the architect is, the reason that the project is not of the finest quality, it's their fault there. So anyway, we all know that. So it's just, why was there never a contract between the architect and the contractor? It is part of the question. But then I'm also was interested in how is it with integrated project delivery that we have this totally different model where these silos disappeared, and it didn't seem to be in the order of every single trajectory of contracts that we've understood to do that. And so what the research yielded, one was the very first contract, and I don't know if this is true in England, the very first contract in the US was between the owner and the contractor. And it was 30 years later before there was an owner and an architect contract. And so it's not just that there's no relationship between them, but there seems to be this kind of hierarchy that sets up a relationship between the owner and the contractor that then has certain assumptions that there doesn't need to be that same kind of relationship until much later on between the owner and the architect. So I thought that was interesting. But the other thing that I found is that traditional contracts are work under the principle of enforcement, which is you do a contract and you live up to the contract because you know that if you don't, you're going to get into trouble. So it's a stick situation. It really was an invention of very few people in California in the 60s, and I hope you're getting the picture of that kind of hippie, who came up with a whole other idea about what contrast could be, which is relational. And it was from that relational contract that certain people who were working in architecture through kind of parametric design came up with the idea of what now is integrated project delivery. So it is an outsider, it's not an evolution. What's interesting to me about that is that the AIA basically doesn't support it. And one reason it doesn't, technically it does, but one reason that it doesn't embrace it fully, even though it could really revolutionize the industry, is that the contracts are so tricky to negotiate that you will probably get your own individual lawyer and you won't buy the AIA contracts. AIA contracts is the main source of income for the AIA. So, just some of that stuff. I should go faster. Okay, part of the theory work is also around unions, learning about a history of architecture unions, the Federation of Architects, Engineers, Chemists, and Technicians, and the history that they had and the social work that they did. This was again during as a result of the Great Depression and the period between World War I and World War II, when most of architects were working for the government, and so there was a reasonable motivation to complain to that single contractor about the work conditions. But again, this is an ongoing condition and ongoing debate today around what the role of unions are in the creative professions. And the lobby is in the midst of coming up with its strategy for unionization now. Okay, now I can really go more quickly. The third and the second part of what we do is performance, which I like to think of as ideological critique. This is the Venice Biennale in 2014, where we first read our manifesto. And just to say, we were not invited. But these are public acts. And so reading the manifesto, but also reading from a book that we had produced, which was the San Precario book. This, we took as a model this idea of a middle class worker, precarious worker who's hoping to sustain or be maintained in a precarious economy. And then we had architects do their own prayers. And so the book was made up of their own prayers and their own images. And so we were passing that out in Venice. In 2016, 2 years later, we also went to the Venice Biennale and did another performance. In this case, again, we were not invited. We're reading from a book that we produced called Asymmetric Labors, the Economy of Architecture in Theory and in Practice. This was a book that I call it performance, but it was also some way theory. This is a collection of essays written by academics, whether they're students, PhD students, or people teaching about the nature of academic value and how people understood their value. And so there are very many, they're very funny, but very observant critiques of how the academy plays into this. And of course, Venice seemed to be a right location for this, since much of the work that goes into the pavilions is unpaid theory work done by the students in the universities that are represented there, or the countries that are represented there. So if you're going to perform in Venice, you got to perform at the National AIA Convention, again, not invited. And this one, we started to perform this inside, and we were on the verge of getting arrested. We came outside and performed the manifesto. Again, as people were going into the convention, somebody said that they thought that if we went to the showroom where they sell goods, that would not be seen as the convention floor. We went back in, performed it in the inside, and we're ushered out. So keep doing it next year. AIA National Convention, again, outside. We're precarious workers, reading the manifesto, blah, blah, blah. And then we also made this was both a performance and the creation of a video called Reworking Architecture, where we built different scenes that enact the kind of humorous, tragic side of architectural work. And then these are, I'll just quickly go through, these are third part practice, and these are kind of actions, these are more practical things. Pledges that we have students who are about to go out into the workforce take that they won't work for any firms that have unpaid internships or don't pay overtime or don't obey legal labor laws, but also tactics for how to negotiate for better pay when you're interviewing in an office. Workshops for professional practice. We did a series of workshops where we basically asked those people who were teaching professional practice, again, the hinge between academia and the real world, about whether they teach to the practice that we have or teach to the practice that we should have, to start a debate going with those academics. Think-ins, and we've had 3 different think-ins in different cities where we ask people from 4 different sides of the AEC industry: labor, firm owners, institutions, which is AIA and CARB, and the media, to talk together about what they think the kind of acupuncture points are in the profession that could loosen it up and make us reinvent ourselves. And then our pocket guide to labor law, which is just coming out so that everybody who's going into the workforce knows what the labor laws actually are. And then finally, our Just Design, which is a certification process that we're working on so that certain firms that have particularly exemplary labor practices will be known to those people when they go to an office. So they choose an office not just for the products that they do and the design that they do, but the kinds of support that they will get as workers in that office. There are criterias and questions that are the standard or indicate the standard of what good practice is under these 6 categories: family friendly, fair pay, legal labor practices, gender and ethnic diversity, transparency, that's transparency about pay and how you rise in the office, and agency, which is how much power you have within the workforce and how much you contribute to the kinds of projects that are being taken. And then, the one more thing, the Not Our Wall. There was we called for a day of protest, the day that the proposals were due for the getting the work of building the border wall. So we asked for a 45-minute walkout so that everybody in architecture office would have 45 minutes to contemplate why they had entered the profession, and whether their office was doing a proposal or not, consider why we would not probably want to enter into that kind of work, let alone other unethical kinds of projects. And this has produced a book. The members of the Bay Area lobby chapter and the LA chapter went down to the prototypes after they were built, and have just come out with the book that is part of their analysis of who built them, what they're claiming is the case, what they're made of, and who knew about it. So that book is in print right now. That's it.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Next, does he need introduction? So, delighted to have Jeremy next, as most of us know, but maybe some don't. Head of Central St Martin's, Pro Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Arts, London. As an architect, Jeremy's worked with Sarah Wigglesworth on their pioneering project 9 Stock Orchard Street, winner of multiple awards and countless articles. But as a writer, his extensive work includes seminal books like Flexible Housing, Architecture Depends, and Spatial Agency, all 3 of which won the RBA President's Award for Research. Thank you.
I thank you all for staying. I was slightly worried that when Mel announced that Reinier was not arriving, that there'd be a mass exodus. but thank you for that. And also, it's been an honor to follow a group of such powerful women, and I don't think it's a kind of accident that the critique of many of the forms of exploitative labor is also a critique of patriarchal behavior, and that there is, although it hasn't been kind of out there on the surface as a feminist critique, I think that is running through some of the discussions that we've been having. My talk is very slight compared to the others, which have been wonderfully expansive and covered the globe, as it were. Mine is about competitions, and I'm using the competition as a lens, or as you'll see, it's actually a magnifying glass, into the conditions of labor within the architectural profession. So it's a sort of going right in deep as to the competition as a system, and then but using it as an example of much wider issues. And I'm going to start with a surprising slide. This is a slide done by Pugin, let's say in about 1840, I guess, in which it's a satire on competitions. So let's just go through it. New church, open competition. To youthful, unemployed, I've lost it, but aspiring architects is what it says. £5 for the best design. Each candidate must send 4 elevations, 3 sections. It's a temple of taste, an architectural repository. So just remember these words. A large assortment of rejected designs selling considerably under prime cost. Then these are a house of call for students. And these are the notices, places and situations. An errand boy for an office who can design occasionally. And this one, sorry, you can hardly read it. A young man who understands surveying would like to go for a year into an office to learn the tasty part. Design prepared estimates, even lower than Sarah's 3%, 1.25%. In a way, I could stop my lecture there, because I think that, Pugin is an unlikely ally, I have to say, as a hardcore conservative Catholic to be putting this up. But I think that he makes all the points. He makes the points about exploitation. He makes a point about the throwing away of architectural knowledge. He makes a point about that if you follow through these implications, the effect that it has on architectural labor and economy. And so, in a way, that is a summary of the lecture that I'm going to give. Right, so let's start. Last time I gave this lecture, I've given it once before, was in an academic conference on competitions, in which the key figures were sitting in the audience. And I have to say, it was the first time I was all but booed off stage. So please don't do that, because it's the home team here, so I'm sure it's going to be fine, isn't it? And it's a interesting group of academics because they have claimed the area of investigation of competitions as their own, and they go around the world to each other's universities on an annual basis, and they give a conference. They all talk to each other about how wonderful competitions are, as you can see from this quote. Excellence in architecture. They function like utopias. And what I want to talk about is how possibly they don't function as utopias. And to do that, to take David Harvey's analysis of utopias, in which he splits up between utopias of spatial form i.e. the ones in which utopia is constructed simply through its spatial identity, or utopias of social processes, which is the more literary or philosophical version. And what Harvey argues is you can't have one without the other, but normally they are separated out. And in this case of the competition, the utopias that those scholars are referring to are clearly utopias of spatial form. And what I want to argue is that that will be presenting a very limited purview of what architecture can do, and many of these conversations have been had about the notion of the object. And on the back of these utopias of spatial form disguises what I'm going to call the dystopias of social process, and the social processes being the processes of the profession's exploitation within the competition process. And I want to do that by looking at two sets of social processes. One is to do with our professional status, and very allied to that, as Peggy has so clearly shown us, is how that our professional status is also bound to our diminished economic status. So let's look at the professional first. The RIBA don't come out of this very well, I should warn you. I gave a lecture at the Bartlett the other day, which Peggy saw one version of it in Yale. And I do really recommend. When's your video coming out?
It's out.
Of Yale?
Yeah.
Oh, is it? It was
No, it's not.
It's not.
Yeah, no, sorry, it's not.
Because people were asking.
Sorry. Yeah, I was thinking the live stream, but that live stream died when the live thing happened.
Right.
Was over.
So we're not going to have video?
We will have a video.
Okay. I do recommend, to continue the discussions, going to the video of the conference that Peggy organised. Anyway, so the Bartlett, I called the RIBA Education Department the NRA of architecture education, because they are presiding over something that is so obviously, transparently awful in terms of its structure, but will do nothing about it. So they don't come up very well here. Now, apart from the terrible language and grammar in this, this statement by the RIBA is very, very exposing. Evidentially unbeatable as a procurement route. And I think that you don't even need to hear my lecture to know that it isn't evidentially unbeatable. But the other thing which is interesting about this is their alliance of what constitutes quality within a competition to it goes on to win an RIBA award. And an RIBA award is not necessarily a signal of good architecture. It's a signal of the status quo of good taste. And I believe me, I'd like to think that in some of my educational work I've done some reasonably good things. I was chair of the RIBA award system, and I was an outright failure. I couldn't shift a thing because the dominance of a certain taste system, which the RIBA award system validates and perpetuates. So this sense that goodness is wrapped up in notions of good taste, good aesthetics, good techniques, which the competition system, as you'll see, absolutely prioritizes. This is a quote from Malcolm Redding, who was generous and brave enough to sit on a platform here last week, and he actually, he was given not that easy a time, and he held his line. This is not a quote from last week. It's actually one of his writings in which he defends endlessly the value of competitions, and of course he would defend endlessly the value of the competitions because he runs competitions, so therefore he needs to defend their value. But I think that the telling term in this is, well, there are two terms. It's wrong for me or anybody to criticize, but it is that term there, which is that competitions are conducted in a partial vacuum, which I think is quite a nice phrase, actually. And it's a vacuum in which a whole set of other dependencies are eliminated from. Most particularly, its social, political, and economic context. That the competition eradicates all these dependencies, and as I write about in Architecture Pens, that's a stupid thing to do. And therefore, what one gets is a very particular set of values played out through the competition in a very, very magnified way. But those values are exactly the ones that we've been talking about today, which are potentially leading to the marginalization of architecture, in as much as that they are the values of taste and aesthetics associated with the production of beautiful buildings by individual heroes. So, what is interesting about this whole thing, though, is how long this has been going on and how long this history of the competition and its association with a certain set of values has been established from the Renaissance through Pugin right to now. So I've been going backwards and forwards in time. In a way, because you kind of think, it's the same with my argument about architecture education. RIBA invented part 1, 2, and 3 in 1885. So it's a Victorian structure that we are still living with. In the same way that the Renaissance competition established, and the key word there is the one of autonomy, established through the competition architecture's autonomy. And one of the reasons that autonomy is established within the competition is, and it's getting magnified and hysterical these days, is there is an inverse effect. As our power as a profession diminishes, the association of the autonomy of the competition increases because it's the only place that we feel that we're still in control. It's the only place in its elimination of the dependencies, in its concentration on the certain values of architecture, that we still believe that we have a power and a control. Is within the competition process. And so what the competition process is, it tricks us into believing that architecture still has this Renaissance autonomy and nobility, which Helen Lipstadt talks about. The other important, well, I'll come back to the socially legitimated. And so this quote from Oud does the same thing, which is, how can a competition presume to have any social, or I would therefore say architectural value, if it dismisses from the process the voice of the client, the voice of the user, the economic context, etc., etc. The only economic context within a competition is the fee submission which you make against the value of the building. But beyond that, other forms of values are eliminated. And Oud suggests that we should therefore be using competitions sparingly. This is, I shouldn't really, I mean, Guggenheim, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. And I shouldn't really use it, but I am just amazed by this slide. So that this is how you sort the 1,793 entries. And that tells me everything about the status of architectural competitions. And it would be a good exercise for us all to actually try to populate this with other words. But of course you can't populate it with other words because the only evidence that you have are 4A1 drawings, pictures. And if all you have is pictures, that's all one can do with the categorization of all these entries. Thank you, Adriana, for this quote, which you used yesterday, which is to go back to this notion that of the establishing of men of taste and the competition doing that in a most extreme manner. The second part then is how this whole process from the Renaissance onwards has been socially legitimated as part of practice. So that it is not seen as an extreme form of practice, it's actually seen as a mirror of normal practice. And in that, all these various forms of value systems and various forms, as I'll talk about later, of exploitations are socially legitimated. It is okay. It's fine to do it. And yet it is so transparently not fine to do it. You should just go, there was an article after Will Hurst did, after the talk here, in which he focused on, in the Architect's Journal, focused on competitions. Go and read the comments. They're very, in a way, I don't need to give my lecture because the comments make the point for me. Now, the processes of the academy also mirror the processes of the competition system. That student projects are indeed conducted in a partial vacuum. They are indeed conducted in an accelerated time frame. They are indeed conducted without the other. They do, other people. Other people only let in on very, very kind of tight leashes. An engineer to come in and do that, a token user to come in and just give a bit of flavor to it, but actually out of the door pretty quickly. But most of all, they are done through the spectacle of the picture, in which the academy, as I talked about at Yale and at the Bartlett, becomes this place of extreme display in which other values of the social, of the political, are often completely overwhelmed by the spectacle and by the display. And there's an interesting bit in Peggy's book by Manuel where he talks about the student having this paradoxical relationship to the academy as both the client, but also the supplier. So that you are paying an awful lot of money, you're demanding a service from that, but interestingly then, the production of your pictures becomes the next stage in the cycle of the commodification of the academy. And so the student already is caught in this paradoxical relationship. And also clearly the notion of sacrifice, which is absolutely explicit within the competition, is germinated within the academy. The long nights, the cruel juries, the tribal aspects, and so on and so forth. So all of these aspects of the academy play straight into aspects of the competition, and therefore establish a certain set of principles by which the profession operates. Actually, I don't really need that, but it's geometrical study. And the other thing that happens within both competitions and the academy, and it's happening in a very, very extreme manner, is that it's producing what can be called a certain type of post-truth architecture. If you are in a vacuum, if you are cut off, you believe fiction has actually become fact. So I'll give you a really good example of this. I'll just read that, will you? Yeah. And there's a whole book of entries to this competition in which, okay, this is a good, I thought quite a good quote, but which is full of absolute fiction like this, and yet presented as if it's fact. So that the competition and the academy leads to a certain type of kind of post-truth architecture because of its removal from an established context of any sort. So that is ready to deal with how the competition establishes a certain set of professional values. And on the back of that, it also establishes a very clear set of economic systems. So what I want to do is a pretty crude analysis of one competition. A competition run by Malcolm Redding, for a dining hall for a Cambridge college. Sort of fairly typical high-end elite competition, in which there was an open call, stage 1 and stage 2. So let's go through that. A crude set of assumptions. Let's just put some notes up here. 1, right? So this is a sort of a set of assumptions, but there are no unpaid interns working. Normal working day. Cost should not improve profit. So there we go. We then put those figures into this. Stage 1, there were 124 entries. This is fact. Let's say this I work with Sarah, and she's tried to get a feeling of how long it takes. 3 labourer days, cost that much. 1 master day. This is just to submit an 8-page document with your credentials on. Not a design at this stage, just to get your credentials down and tell a story about why you should be submitted. So that is already £250,000, just for that first stage entry. Stage 2, the entries are whittled down to 24. 24? Why do you need 24? I'll tell you why you need 24 a bit later. And this is by this stage you're actually submitting pictures, and the pictures take a bit of time to do. So there we have another 133. Then we're down to a short list of 5, in which we're really ramping it up by this stage. So we're about £500,000. Let's just go through some notes here, shall we? Number 1, this is an underestimate. Master days. We gave it to some juniors. This is a good direct quote, by the way, from the competition, but ended up doing it ourselves. That's quite common, I think, that you sort of you hope that your unpaid intern is going to produce the thing, but actually, because they're unpaid, they're not very good. Therefore, they don't do it very well. Yeah, that's nice, isn't it? We appreciate how all the long list of teams visited the site, so that the master had to go and visit the site, all 24 of the masters. Each finalist received an honorarium of £10,000 versus the real cost of that. Yeah. Total budget, that's, say, 7%, because this is a Cambridge college, they do actually pay 7%. So the architectural fee is £350,000. The wasted architectural labour is £500,000. And these figures, one could actually, they're thereabouts probably. My point is very simple, is that there is an extraordinary waste of architectural economy going on within the competition process. And we're not even anywhere near Guggenheim. And I often say to Sarah that and because all these competitions, there's the shortlist, there's 24 names, they're pretty much the same on all these all the Malcolm Redding competitions. Yeah, you might have a couple of new people coming in, but they're pretty much the same. So why don't architects do, well, I now know why they don't do, why don't they throw competitions? So it'd be really good if you actually form the cartel in which the final 5, and you ring each other up and say, look, we're all doing it together, why don't I win this one? Yeah? Why don't you wear really bad clothes on the day, design a dog of a building and insult the client, and then I'll get the job. But now we know we can't do that because we'd all be in jail. But there is a sense within this that we are, of course, our own worst enemies in not colluding, in actually being complicit with engaging with the process. Oh. Let's go to another one, because this is... This is an open competition. 201 entries. Let me show you a typical entry. It is tragic, this. I'm not saying the architecture is tragic, by the way. I'm just saying about the waste is tragic. This is probably a desperate underestimate. And still doesn't have the funds. I checked on the website yesterday. They're saying it might be built within 5 years. And this was an RIBA-run competition. The RIBA competition department was turned into a cost centre 4 years ago, which meant it had to generate profit, so that they are actually ramping up the number of these exploitative systems, which they are sanctioning as part of a professional thing. And what is the other thing which I didn't talk about earlier, but I think it is really worth talking about, is how can the RIBA or these academics or whoever actually talk about excellence if what one is valuing is done in a partial vacuum. And again, you know, it's never a good day when Sarah gets back from a competition interview, because you know they normally say, oh, we don't want a model, and she'll get back and say, well, you know, I was tripping over models as I was trying to get into other people's models. But the classic one is when the client rings up and says, well, in the end, we didn't like your elevations. And you say, what? I wasn't designing a building. You were looking for an architect. You weren't looking for a building. And that is the biggest mistake of the whole process, is that what a competition should be doing is looking for an architect and not looking for a building. Because how can that building have any legitimacy if it is designed within this vacuum? How can you possibly engage with the complexities of the client? How can you possibly have a discussion about the brief? So what happens with these competition systems is it throws up a set of fait accomplis. They're very rarely changed afterwards, as if the architect has the power of genius to allow them to assimilate all these complex issues and from that churn out the perfect product. So that this sense that the RIBA are perpetuating exactly that form of production which Peggy and others have been talking about, in which we associate ourselves simply with the production of pictures, because you're not doing objects for a competition, you're just doing pictures, as opposed to the production of architectural knowledge. And therefore, the competition system does exactly what Peggy and others have been talking about, in the sense of it marginalizes what might actually be the real value of the architect by reducing it down to a form of aesthetic production. And this is really shocking. That statement that's why they need the 24. Because the client basically is on a fishing expedition in which the architects seem quite willing to offer up this set of designs. Now, my question would be, why doesn't the client have a better idea in the first instance? Why doesn't the client have a set of concerns, a set of values of their own, a set of parameters which are strong enough to not need the fishing exhibition of this exploration by a number of designers? And again, this comes up time and time again through the competition process. And certainly in something like the tragic one I just showed, the Great Fen, the other thing which the RIBA actually put into this competition guide is I can't believe they write this. They actually say, this is for clients, by the way, competitions are a good way to raise the profile of your building. That what architects are doing is acting as PR agents on behalf of the Great Fen. So the Great Fen used the architecture competition as a means of trying to raise money, which they still haven't. And then when Malcolm says this, you do really worry about what parallel universe the competition system is operating on, that the client is seen to be taking all the risk. And I don't know if you read the thing down the bottom, but out of the RIBA system, only 11 were junked out of 34, I think, and 3 given to another architect. So that's not a great track record. The others might have gone on to win an RIBA awards. Now, yeah, Russell Curtis did this much better than I can. So, he didn't do this, which is the sort of the wall of shame. It took me ages to do this, I tell you. So, it's relatively unpaid. When it was abandoned, Malcolm wrote a thing in the AJ, and he said, all is not lost. The website has been visited by 4.5 million people to show what an important competition this was. And there is, again, a complete inverse relationship between self-importance there, but if you do it through the frame of architectural labour, the more successful the competition is in terms of numbers, the more tragic it is. Therefore, the frame of architectural labour at this moment becomes a very good one for the critique of the competition system, and by implication, if you agree with my argument at all, it's a very good way of deconstructing some of the structures of the architecture profession. And it is, there's nothing new going on here. 1889, it's fantastic, a vampire draining the profession of its blood. And when Louis Kahn says this, I suspect he's saying it in one of his sort of, kind of aphoristic manners that's good. Whereas I'm reading it through the frame of labour as the offering of sacrifice. The sacrifice of the individual, but with it, the sacrifice of the profession. And it's not just because Peggy was in the audience that I'm quoting her. I actually quoted her the first time round I did this. But of course, this is so true, because in the vacuum of the competition, in which we feel that we have the last vestiges of control, the last vestiges of so-called experimentation, the last vestiges of actually trying things out. That's another argument. Good place to try things out. That we forget that actually what we're doing is a form of labour. And Peggy's point in this one is that we have to always recognise whatever we do, and what precarious workers were saying earlier, absolutely true. We should all do their survey. At what moments, and if you weren't here, go onto their website and take their survey, to actually be brutally honest with ourselves about how much free labour we're giving away. So it is not, I don't think, too big a ask at this stage to compare the Guggenheim as an extreme example, the competition system, to what are called logo mills. Logo mills, if you don't know what they are, about this, in which a client can upload a brief. My company makes anthrax, I want a new logo which doesn't make me look evil, yeah, or whatever, yeah? And then from around the world, 700 designers. I mean, it's obvious, yeah? It's lovely, isn't it? Hire 700 designers and pay only one. And this is now a fairly established form of graphic design production. Exploiting in particular what's interesting, so the density is the number of entries made to the logo mill. So it's exploiting in particular the global south as places of cheap labour. But if you take the argument about the logo mill and then apply it to architectural practice, I think we're in a fairly deep hole. And I think the argument does sort of work. We've talked about the precariat, but I think that this quote from Guy Standing, who was one of the original kind of documenters of the precariat, is interesting, because the precariat is too often associated with a form of unskilled labor, Deliveroo, Uber, or whatever. But as the talk this morning showed, actually it isn't unskilled labor. It applies across the whole patch, which is why its kind of notion of the precariat as a new class is interesting, because it challenges notions of working class and upper class and makes a new form of class, which is also why it's often criticized by Marxists, because they think it over stresses that at the expense of the analysis of the exploitation of the working class. But I think that if you put that together and then read architect in there, exactly what we were talking about before and exactly what Peggy's holding up outside the AIA becomes rather real. It lives with anxiety, chronic insecurity, teetering on the edge. I'm sorry, I'm meant to end up jolly, and I'm ending up not very jolly. I come back right at the end, maybe. But with this sense of economic exploitation, and then the chain of events that sets up, which Pugin rather beautifully describes in terms of free labor, unpaid interns, etc., etc. The key point about it, which is, there's another quote coming up from Peggy, right after the Rem Koolhaas one, is that what it does is to throw away architectural knowledge. And it throws away architectural knowledge because it doesn't value architectural knowledge, because the whole thing is simply vested within the picture, rather than in the various forms of knowledge that went into the construction of the picture. And therefore, how would one design a competition system which actually looks at forms of architectural knowledge as opposed to forms of architectural objects? And that seems to me to be, in a way, the next architectural competition that we should run, is to redesign the architectural competition. And I was very glad to hear that I think the best work being done by it, because it has a sort of realpolitik about it, is that of Walter Menteth and Russell and the group around Project Compass, who are looking at forms of procurement and have begun to evolve systems of new forms of competition system, which don't rely to the extent that the RIBA does on the things I've talked about. So if we go back to the notion of utopias, or the dystopia of social processes, and we look at David Harvey's solution, which is that of a spatial temporal utopianism, i.e. that a utopia can't exist as pure form, nor as pure social process, but it brings those two together in a spatial temporal condition. What would that mean to the redesign of competitions? So I'm just going to end up with three very quick suggestions. First of all, to change the role of the competition. This seems to be absolutely necessary, i.e. not to see the competition as the production of things which might look like buildings, but instead to do it as it really should be, which is a competition is about finding the architect with the most empathy with the client, the architect who actually is open and generous in relation to the client, and the architect who has the forms of knowledge which the client needs, and that would take it away from notions of the object. I often say, I think the most important thing that one can do as a designer is redesign the brief or co-design the brief with the client. But the competition, of course, gives the brief as a form of fait accompli. Get on with it. And rolling out of that, obviously, is to change the value system through which competitions are assessed. So these two are sort of, once you've changed the role, then the value system through which they're assessed also has to change. And then the final bit is change the economic system of competitions. What Project Compass talk about is sortation, which is everybody can put in a very brief outline, and then there's random selection of the shortlist for people who've got over the first thing. Now, you may say that's really weird. Why would you do that? And my answer would be, well, actually, competition process is so random anyway that it doesn't make any difference whether the random selection is done by a group of biased judges or by a computer. And so you might as well do that. And having sat on both sides of a competition table, that sat as a judge in a competition, it is completely random. It can come down to how the architect dresses. In one sense, the people I thought were the most compelling set of architects, the client, who was a local authority, just thought they looked weird, and they were out of the picture. So that the notion, so it is a very, very random event, and in a way, the randomness of it also potentially makes the bit up front, the autonomy, even stranger, because you're sort of, you have no idea how the thing's going to end up, so you might as well just do what you want to do. So those are my three, and I could go on, versions of how competitions may change. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I think we are now going to do a silent talk in memory of Anna Hart, perhaps. Maybe Anna's here. He likes doing silent walks. So a silent talk. So I'm certainly not going to try and interpret these slides, but we did feel that having Reinier stranded at his airport and having him have done this work, it was absolutely right to show it to you. And I'll try and go not too fast over the bits with writing on the basis that there's certainly a thread that we can all read here. Perhaps at this point I'll also read Reinier's bio. Reinier de Graaf, 1964, Schiedam, is a Dutch architect and writer. He's partner in the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, where he leads projects in Europe, Russia, and Middle East. Reinier is co-founder of OMA's think tank AMO and a visiting professor in architecture and urban design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He is recently the author of the book Four Walls and a Roof, The Complex Nature of a Simple Profession. Yeah, I'll wait with that one. That's an important one.
I think projects that weren't built.
That's all projects, that's built projects. Oops. I'm going to chair this last session, and I think that clearly I'm going to perhaps just do a little bit of a summary of what we just heard, and then maybe I'm going to direct one question to Peggy and Jeremy, and then I think we'll open up, because no doubt everybody, including our previous speakers, can also contribute to this if we see it as a sort of summing up of the whole really fantastic day and a half. I think from my perspective, what was really fantastic about this last panel was, in a way, what I think was two very profound rereadings of architectural practice, a sort of double take moment, which I think is really, with all of the research and interesting sort of comments that we've had, this moment of being able to make a double take. So Peggy's, for me, is a double take that we do work, and we need to understand ourselves as part of a set of people who work. We're not other. We're not doing things for people, and therefore we can't separate ourselves. And one of the very powerful first comments that other creative people don't. They believe they do work. Artists understand what they do as work. Why is it that we don't? And I think that there's a real double take in that. I really think that that's quite important. The second, Jeremy's point, again, a complete excavation and unpacking of how competitions provide us with effectively a partial vacuum about the profession or what we do, perhaps also echoed in education, which really distorts the value of what we do down to a very small spatial tectonic form. And I think I've said this once, but I may as well say it again, I think that comes home every day, actually, in certain dealings that we have with the profession. So a recent part 2 visit, where we talked about the other extended design roles with the spatial, the complexity beyond the spatial, was taken by an RIBA panel as sort of insufficient, that ultimately it is about tectonic form and construction. So I think those are really powerful points. I think that also the thing that's come to me across the day and a half is also the systemic issues. We've talked a lot. It's been really revealing to talk about law, to re-understand our profession and the way in which we operate, plus the other operations across the sort of fields of legal and legislation, prosecution, right at the beginning, through to different ethical codes. So I think that those are really powerful things, that some of the ways that we might need to act. I thought perhaps, though, somewhere in the middle of all of those things, maybe a first question we could talk about, because both Peggy and Jeremy talk very powerfully about the profession and intervening in it, disrupting it, or otherwise finding the way in which it constrains, is Peggy's point about deprofessionalising. And I just thought maybe we could go through your views on that, and also perhaps the other speakers' views on that. So perhaps, Peggy, just reiterate what you have a strong feeling about this.
This first came up when I was attending Phil Bernstein's professional practice advanced course, and had somebody who was, I think, the person who guides architectural project construction projects at Stanford University, who was trained as an architect, but now had gone over to the other side, and had watched then architects, interview and whatever, and she came up with the analysis is like, since there were so many things kind of that came with negative connotations about the architect, and in some way prevented them from explaining their work individually because they were trying to explain the value of architecture. She said, why do we have a profession? And here was a smart person who saw it from both ends, and it's like, oh, and partly because in other classes, in Phil Burns' professional practice class, we're trying to like, why isn't architecture like directing a movie, where in directing a movie everybody gets credit, and how is it? So reading all these things that weren't professional were the analogies, and so what are we getting from being a profession? Other than the negative stuff, it's like, oh, architect, I get it, all the things I'm saying, egocentric, not gonna listen to me, too expensive, and less dismissive, as opposed to asking profound questions about what value we really have.
Jeremy.
Because at the Yale Symposium, I called for, where I was talking about education and validation and the way the validation process embodies and perpetuates some of the things that we're both talking about, and therefore actually the simplest thing is just get rid of protection of title. And Phil Bernstein jumped down my neck and said, as soon as you lose title, protection of title, then you also lose economic status. It was sort of what he was saying, I think. And I suppose that rather than deprofessionalisation, we could talk instead about a kind of a different description of what the profession is. And if we did that in its expanded field and got away from the identification of architecture with the production of buildings and not the consequences of buildings and what comes before and what comes after, then you could actually have a quite interesting conversation about what the profession then means. And the people who've done it absolutely brilliantly are the surveyors. The surveyors used to have a very, very limited, this is in the UK, limited definition of what constitutes a surveyor. They measure buildings or whatever. And they just, when they saw the whole thing happening, when they saw the whole of the production built environment being carved up into little pieces, they claimed every bit of the food chain by expanding definitions. So whether they're project managers, whether they are quantity surveyors, whether they are post-occupancy facility managers, whether they are, they basically took the whole thing because they weren't bothered about a limited description of a Victorian surveyor, whereas we still have a limited description of Victorian architect. So that if we could, and there'd be endless conversations about urban design. Shouldn't we be moving in urban design? Shouldn't that be part? And it can't even do that. So that I think that the discussion should be not necessarily about deprofessionalisation, but about reprofessionalisation in terms of an expanded description. And of course, and since Tatiana's here, the expanded description clearly is that of spatial agency.
I'll just push back because I really do think deprofessionalization is a different thing. But that's we're all looking for something different, and maybe that's the way. But deprofessionalization is something that Marxists want because it is a protective thing, and that protectionism is about elitism and all of those things. But it's also something that the far right, Milton Friedman is like, get rid of professions, get certification. So it's a both extreme left and extreme right idea. But I do think in some way it's related to the possibility that you wouldn't do this one huge thing, which is have all this expensive education that goes through an accredited school, and you do your internship, and then you do all that stuff. There could be degrees of it, and it's almost more interesting to me to think about the degrees, and I think deprofessionalization is an easier way of having steps of expertise than steps within the profession, but that might be wrong, it really could be.
And I think those steps of, you know, what you can do with 3 years out, what you can do 10 years out, what you can do, begins to have the public and the clients say, and specifically, what do you know? In 10 years, it's like, I know the environment, I know, you know, public space, I know all of those things. Or even 3 years, I don't know construction, but I do know community development. You know, that it begins to get, I think, at the things that you and Tatiana are talking about.
Any of our other speakers want to respond to that point? Kadenbari?
I mean, Shumi, within the 5 examples you gave, what did those younger practices see them? Do they still call themselves architects? Yeah.
They do, on account of the education they paid for, I think, rather
Right.
than what they get to do and how that's perceived. I'm not sure how much all of them were. Sorry. Hi. I'm not sure how much all of them were speeding towards the ultimate goal of building a building. Some of them, yes. Some of them, that seemed to be less important, which suggests that this wider way of practicing and still getting acknowledgement might be possible.
Your comment made me think about when you started, you know, how much they paid for their education, and clearly there's a link between how the profession has evolved with your education system. And I think we were maybe talking about that a little bit yesterday or maybe last night is the one thing the US has that I don't think exists anywhere else is the liberal arts model for education, like undergraduate degree where you're doing architecture as a major degree with other subjects, other expertise, and only, you know, in our case where I teach, only 50% of our students would go on to graduate architecture, et cetera, But if you're looking at architecture as a more expanded field with other types of expertise, I think they also still have, you know, they have to learn, and we have to learn or teach architecture in other contexts and its interactions with other disciplines. So that, you know, to study humanities or social sciences or environmental sciences, I mean, it's a vast field, but I think this issue is linked to education in my mind. Yeah.
Yes, maybe we could run over with the Marsha. Oh, yes, don't mind. Kadenbari, yes, gives you some exercise.
Thanks very much. I guess
We're all
I'm
workers
really
here.
excited to hear what you're saying, Jeremy, because I was just thinking about, you know, when I went to art school, we were advised that 3% of us would go on to make it in the art market. So 3% of us would go on to be artists of that ilk. And at the time, it never occurred to me to question the political economy of that statement and say, doesn't that mean you're basically educating for a 97% failure rate by your own terms? And I guess something that I think is really exciting about what you're saying is if we're thinking about this practitioner as being something different, then what does that actually mean in terms of the educational structure? How do we ensure that people are really, excited about a variety of different possible futures? What kind of education then do we provide? And I think the point about liberal arts is a really vital one, but I think it's also about sort of how we encourage our students to think about their futures and refuse this idea of being the failed artist or the failed architect. That seems to be really essential, so to empower them in that regard. I've got to say, I'm really fascinated to hear that artists value their work in terms of on the terms that you're describing, Peggy, because I think that's great to hear. That's certainly not been the experience of precarious workers brigade. There's a tendency rather to, and the message is often, you know, you're doing this not because it's a job, but because it's passion. You know, this is sort of this passion work, that this kind of narrative that I think we want to challenge. So I think the kind of message that you're disseminating is a good one, but I'm just not sure that we're quite there yet.
Yeah, when I tell artists that I say this, is kind of like, I don't think we're so great. They have a different, but still, I would
point out the fact that in critical theory and aesthetic critical theory, as an architect, until very, very recently, if you wanted to get a relevant discourse going or a relative article to students, you went to art criticism. There was no architecture criticism. So you might say that about the artist, but there's a whole, whether we're talking about, October or critical inquiry, whatever it is, there is a tradition of critical theory within art practice that there is just not in architecture. None. Zero.
Well, maybe that's a project for all the people who choose not to go into building buildings. They can start to develop that precise discourse.
Yeah, right.
I think I'd open it up also to others in the audience. So we've got one up there.
Thank you. I'll just add to that there's two academics in the UK, one in performing arts and one in fashion, who write about passion work and all these kind of questions. And one is Jen Harvey at Queen Mary University, and the other is Angela McRobbie at Goldsmiths. That's not my question. It's to Peggy. I really enjoy following your work. I've kind of seen a number of your talks as the years have gone on. And the last talk I heard you talk about how you work with your students to try to, I guess, sort of disrupt the behaviours of staying up all night and so on. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about those kind of strategies that you can disseminate through architecture teaching, especially in a studio environment.
Yeah, I feel slightly self-conscious because I feel that they're weak gestures in a system that is kind of profoundly dehumanizing in some way. But one is that I do ask my students to sign a pledge that they will not do an all-nighter as long as they're in my studio. And I ask them to mark their hours, so that in some way they're conscious of wasted hours, and it's not like they're going to get critiqued for more or less hours. Is just to be conscious of the fact that you can, if you're interested in going home and eating with your partner or whatever, create an idea of efficiency as opposed to the assumption. And I'm anyway, that you can just go forever and so work slowly or whatever. But also at the crit, making sure that the people who come don't put their backs to the students, because in the end we're teaching the students, and so the jurors are invited to sit on the side so that the students are actually addressed in that way. But I guess in some way I'm interested in giving projects that I don't know the outcome. So I do think that it becomes apparent that we're going through this somewhat as equals, that in some way I think I indicate that I know how to get the best work out of them, but I don't know the answer to the question in any way, shape, or form. But I suspect all of us teachers do that. I'm not sure that that's so unusual.
But to pick up on that, I give a seminar here to the master's students in which I kind of rant and rave in my normal fashion and critique the outside world. And the question that always comes, and it's absolutely the right one, is, but Jeremy, the outside world is the one we're going to go into, and how can we take what you're teaching us and we're talking about into the outside world if it's just going to get squashed? Because the structures of the outside world are so overwhelming in terms of the structure of the profession in particular. And I have to say, I'm not sure I have a good enough answer for that. And that sounds a bit irresponsible.
But I think that's an interesting point that I was also going to pick up on that came through for me from Marsha's talk and then compounded in this panel, was the idea that, in a way, it's not just about the topics or styles of education, but actually a fundamental reordering of the hierarchy by which students understand how they can take some control. And because I think that by upending that, that's possibly the way. And I think that Marsha's, wherever she is, there she is, I think Marsha and Sophie's talk was sort of prompting that through some of the exercises to question who is in control, what the values are, and to really sort of slightly level the playing field as opposed to perpetuate maybe quite conservative structures, because that's, I think, whatever our best intentions. So my second question was also about conservatism. I mean, it feels that perhaps, I guess the second part of the question about deprofessionalising or the profession is whether the problem is that the conservatism that you talk about, Jeremy, is a product of being in a profession. We're all scared to leave it. And I don't know if you want to... Well, because we've paid for things, but even if we started again, would that be a problem?
Well, I suppose, yeah, I mean, the conservatism in Peggy's analysis, and to some extent mine, is bred by the context of the marketplace in which we're operating. And if the marketplace is so powerful, it's very difficult to be anything other than conservative in relation to a compliance with that marketplace. So I think that I don't think it's conservative. Yeah, you can say it has a certain conservative values and it's Victorian, blah, 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 but one has to be realistic about its relationship to the wider structures and how controlling they are. Which, again, is why the students asked me that question, quite rightly asked that question. If the structures are so controlling, how do we find our own agency within them?
Let's have some more questions.
Can I just... Yep. I think what lingers in the back of preserving the profession and its conservative nature is the panic that we might be vocational. You know, it's like, oh my God, we're a profession and we all go to these elite schools, and some people are going to vocational schools and they're learning to do BIM, and they're going to be CAD monkeys, and and so the kind of vocational professional thing is deeply embedded in why we're going to do the professional thing, and it's such a class thing. It's such a class idea. It's like, what's wrong with vocational? I just want to know.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, great. Let's have Jake, this, and then Megan.
Hiya. I wanted to actually start by just a little quote, which is from the philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti. And he says, "Ambition is a form of self-interest, a form of enclosure, and therefore it breeds mediocrity of mind. To live in a world that is ambitious and not be ambitious means to do something that you really love, and that is very difficult. Magazines, television, newspapers and radio constantly emphasize the worship of success. When you are ambitious, you are merely adjusting to a particular pattern of society, so therefore you are living on a very superficial level. I think a real school, through its students, should bring a blessing to the world, for the world needs a blessing. It's in a terrible state, and the blessing can only come when we ourselves are not seeking power. Intelligent is the mind that does not think in any particular pattern, but is free in itself and therefore able to see what is true and put aside what is not." So, he seems quite like strong advocate of no competition at all. And I was wondering through that, and maybe towards the end of your action points, Jeremy, about how you'd improve competitions, was there not a sort of a more absolute argument for no competition whatsoever, and that has to start within within the academic environment? And yet we see, I'd say through fear mainly, institutions such as ourselves putting up grade boundaries for those entry applications. That's pressure of the market. First thing you do when you enter first year is you enter technical competition, and then at the degree show, it's a competition for the best spaces allocated by the sort of, what was that phrase that popped up in your thing? The good taste of the tutors. And so that's another competition there. And I think a lot of hypocrisy tends to happen at these kind of spaces. And I'd researched hypocrisy, and another Judeo-Christian thing is it tends to stem from fear. So your biggest fears lead to your biggest hypocrisies. So just a sort of a more frank discussion about what do you fear greatest, and it might just be the market capitalism we all live in, or is there slightly more personal fears that we could speak of quite openly here that need to be shone a light on in order for spaces, academic spaces, to become more promoting collaboration and not competition in quite a strong way.
Thank you. Off you go.
Well, I suppose I have to answer that, don't I? Because
we're all academics, so
yeah, but in particular, being head of this place, which is rife with ambition, and rife, I think, sometimes with unacceptable competition, and it is a difficult one. That I sort of say I say to students when they're coming, you're not allowed to be arrogant, but you can be confident. But I also do talk about ambition, but it's not necessarily in the way that you described it there. And I think that there is students, I think, should be ambitious. I find nothing wrong with that notion of being ambitious, as long as the values by which that ambition is measured have an ethic to them. So I don't fully agree with you that it's to do with a collaborative consensus or a sort of sense of just of stripping away some of those ambitions. But possibly, I think you're probably right to say they should be reframed better.
But is there a fear that's preventing you from reframing it better?
Well, I mean, yeah, there is a fear that if one takes, for want of a better example, the world's greatest fashion course, the fear is that it becomes no longer the world's greatest fashion course, because if you took your line and you rolled it out completely through MA Fashion, the exceptional work and people coming out of that would not be so exceptional, I don't think. Or they'd be exceptional in a way which the market afterwards wouldn't tolerate. So I'd hold my hands up on that one. Yes, there is a fear that you lose a kind of status.
I agree with you that the market afterwards won't tolerate it, but then we can turn to Mel and say, thankfully for architecture, we don't have to necessarily, especially our status is nowhere near that. Well, yeah, but I just mean we don't have to have the weight of the world's best architecture course. We're grateful for that, I think, a lot of us, and we don't have to consider that. We're at this seminar all to be doing the exact opposite. So, same question is, what fears prevent you from perhaps acting on some of the stuff you've talked about today?
I'd probably agree with Jeremy that I sort of don't. I have an ambition for the students on our courses that would be about. I mean, I would be horrified if people thought they were on an architecture course or, in a course that was down at the bottom, and therefore we didn't have to have any ambition for ourselves. So, and also, I think there's a natural sense of wanting to. I agree. There's a natural sense that ambition is part of everyday life. So I understand what you're saying. You're saying that we don't have anything to lose, but I think that's a bit harsh. And I guess for me, it's also quite extreme in the sense that if we look at, let's say, more experimental space of learning and teaching, perhaps where we have less to lose in your argument, then I would say that we're probably approaching some of those things, and I don't think that's particularly sort of egocentric of me to say so. So I think experimentation can happen. It just doesn't have to be quite as extreme radical. We had a Megan and then Liza.
Hello, thank you. I think the way it's really interesting, the deprofessionalization argument versus the reprofessionalization argument, because I think we all agree, working in the UK and the US, that something needs to change in the professional organization. And so the two different standpoints, I think, are very interesting. So I guess the question first is this something that you see as a dismantling of AIA and RIBA, or is it a kind of a taking over of AIA, RIBA? Because it seems like there's two different schools of thought there. And then along those lines, if you think about a role, I know the AIA in particular, of lobbying, which they don't do very effectively, but part of their role is technically to lobby for architects in Washington and in states. And looking at Reinier's slides, so much, he had a few slides about the investment that the Dutch government put into architecture. And likewise, the Danish government put a bunch of money into promoting architecture. And that's around the time we got BIG and all the other famous Danish firms, the time we got all the famous Dutch firms. And so, just thinking about grassroots kind of work at a certain level, but then what a professional organization could potentially do, such as lobbying governments to increase governmental funding, such as, we made that work as possible because the Mayor of London is putting money into initiatives that they can apply for funding for, and therefore they don't have to subject themselves to the market. I guess I'd just like for you both to kind of talk a little bit about what you think about the role of those professional organizations are moving forward, because something needs to be done.
The AIA wouldn't exist in deprofessionalization, but that would not be a tragedy, It's a club that is meant to make architects feel good about themselves in the midst of a crappy situation. You give awards to yourselves and give, particular, FAIA status to certain people, it does take on as its job to get work from the government. That's its main job, to secure work from the government. So that would go away. But I think for me, it might be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, to think about deprofessionalization. But I think the damage to the profession is so extreme, to start from scratch would be a good thing.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It is always a question: is it better to work inside the tent through trying to change systems from within, or is it better to stand outside and shout? And I've done both. I failed miserably when I was. I did. I went in. I was chair of the RIBA award system, and I failed miserably. And I think that I would fail miserably trying to deconstruct. I failed miserably trying to deconstruct their educational system. So I'm a failure at being inside. So I think at a personal level, I would agree with Peggy. I think you have to start again. It is very, very compromised as a set of institutions, and what the AI did the day after Trump was just a very visible tip of a much larger iceberg.
Can we, Liza? Did you have a?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe start on Peggy, just to be celebratory, so that also then expand on to everything we heard today. And sadly, I wasn't here yesterday, but I'm sure that was that too. So just the sheer generosity of your body of work. Maybe as an academic, you claimed it as research. You sometimes got a bit of sabbatical, but this sheer generosity when academia is definitely under threat and underfunded, and it's hard for students who are paying big fees to feel like their teachers are not having a hard time because they're paying such big fees. But it's sort of interesting, Mel's point about what the RIBA Visiting Board criticised the school for was, there wasn't enough real world. There wasn't enough of the tectonics of the profession, when actually perhaps today and yesterday there isn't enough academia in the profession. That this body of work of today and yesterday is the speaking, imagine if they had a little bit more of academia in that that real world. And so maybe the challenge to lobby and to who built your architecture is how do you make, and precarious workers, how do you make the elegant diagram as big as the inflatable rat? You know, how could that body of research just come and march up to those professions? And I think that generosity is what describes this, and that the students who are here, you know, you actually have to be more ambitious, because in this sort of place of an alternative, you have to be as big as an inflatable rat. And so it probably is that inflatable rat, which is the tectonics that Mel's describing, because how do you design things that hold both a critique and a productive alternative, a joyful alternative in the things that you draw. So there's no opt-out here, unfortunately. And then lastly, you know, how can we find that place? You know, is it a MIPIN? Like, what is the role of this institution to kind of just elbow itself in? Like I feel that with the Wall project, you really did. It was like, sorry, you know, the kind of spotlight came upon it. So I just like to celebrate the generosity that we've had from everybody, and that's what I'd like to say.
Thank you.
But I think you're dead right about this thing of reaching other audiences. I remember when Tatiana and I were doing spatial agency at Sheffield, and we did a set of conferences, symposium, we realised in the end it was the same group of people travelling around Europe and speaking to each other. And I think things have moved on since then. The audience has expanded. And I think that at the moment of let's say, crisis, which we're going through, in terms of political crisis, economic crisis, and environmental crisis, then we are duty-bound to actually present not so much the alternative, but other ways of doing things, as the centre is sort of collapsing in front of us. And and to seize that moment, and I really do think there's a moment. That's where my optimism is.
I've just thought of a positive thing to say as well, because I was at a meeting of a big project managers. So they are project managers to build mega projects, and they invited their clients. So it's kind of like smoothie, whatever the schmooze your client session. But it was about how can you design the process of mega projects to make space for creativity. That was the question, and the head of the Natural History Museum, the head and other museums said, for number one, get rid of the CGI in the procurement process, because we're stuck with this thing which our funders thought they were going to get, and you haven't even dug one hole. You haven't done a single survey. So I think the idea that the work stage, how would you redesign the work stages to give space for exploration and, as Mel said, experimentation, maybe is a positive place to start. And then
Can I just say something about not that last comment, but the earlier one, which is in some way to bring the humanities into the profession, and relate that to the Not Our Wall thing. I think it's an interesting point. The point that I take from that is that if, for example, the AIA or the profession was allowed to openly debate the ethics of a border wall, as opposed to sound bites from the CEO of the AIA, and that it became a platform for real discussion, we would, I think, internally begin to bring on those humanities. We'd think in that ethical fashion about the larger issues that are more humanistically based. But as long as you close off those discussions because they're political and they're hotbeds and you're going to offend somebody by doing it, we're in no way going to invite that, you preclude that conversation. But I think this is the point that Shimi was making earlier in the discussion, if we showed that to the public, I think we would be more respected. That we're actually a place where these important things are vetted, and in some way we're a place that can vet them probably more completely or more significantly than any other place, because we have such impact on people's daily lives by the spaces that we make and the spatial divisions that we have. You know, we're kind of uniquely in a position to debate those things, and would get respect for that. But we make sure that we don't do that.
Yeah. It's coming.
Okay. Thank you for all presentations, also from this morning. It seems like something is wrong with architecture. That's quite clear, I think, to everyone. And this day today was about labor specifically, and how reorganizing labor might change also these conditions of architecture. And I just wanted to just point out a couple of things that stuck out for me today, which came through comments by the Workers' Brigade this morning, and now you also, Peggy, Jeremy, and others also. There was, I think, a sense of the need for a plan. Peggy, you talked about piecework, and piecework being the worst kind of labor. And earlier on there was a comment as well that most architectural practices are actually quite small, and it's very, very fragmented. So this somehow, and sorry, my head is buzzing, I don't quite know how to pin it together, but there seems to be something quite interesting in this notion of collectivization that came out in different presentations today. Funnily enough, also in one of the slides by Reinier de Graaf, also where there was a thing about mergers and acquisitions. And I think we see this happening in the cooperative movement at the moment, where small cooperatives are merging with other cooperatives to form larger cooperatives, so to create a certain moment of power to intervene somehow. And I think this notion of collectivization, which also was in the Workers' Brigade discussion this morning, sort of having a bigger force behind which you could do something, that was for me very, very powerful. There was also something about values, and this was quite strong in a couple of presentations as well. Certain pledges to be made, certain cards to be taken out when you don't really agree with something. So a notion of responsibility or value towards certain things, which was really strong. And maybe bringing in quite an overt feminist perspective now as well. The question might then be how to, and I'm rephrasing Donna Haraway here, how to create an ability to respond to these questions. How can we foster something that allows us to intervene more productively in these discussions, which have been around for so long, that I'm also at times losing a little bit of hope. No? When I listen again to another set of things, it seems like starting over and over again. So how can this sense of urgency be somehow turned into something whereby a different kind of action comes out of this? So yeah, lots of sorry.
Thanks, Tatjana. That was. Do we have any response?
I think it's great. Yeah. But you're right too. But I thought that Peggy's two-parter actually began to answer some of your questions, as much as it goes from critique into action, and that is beholden on us all to do that.
Compliment.
Yeah, I think the architecture lobby, I think particularly is a powerful way of seeing how the collective is stronger than maybe the fragmented, neoliberalized subject.
I mean, I appreciate that. There are two things that I think about in that. One is the debate that happens within the lobby between collectivization and cooperatives, and I know those are different things, but as models for work versus unionization, and union people, make the point that Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, that collectives and cooperatives are islands within a sea of capitalism, and they don't bring on the revolution, whereas unions bring on the revolution. This is, it's an interesting debate, and part of that is like, do you believe in the revolution or whatever? But just to say that that terms like collective have histories and are debated, but the other is something that I keep thinking about now, which is radical democracy. And radical democracy, is not about coming to consensus, but about keeping the debate alive again and again and again, so that no one is resting on a false sense of having arrived, but you're always working at trying to listen to oppositions, to think about, a moving forward that understands divisiveness, but understands that too. And so the kind of liveliness that doesn't come to conclusions, I think, is still completely productive and disruptive. Mm-hmm. And in some way, that is what I wish, whatever organization it could be, whether it's the lobby or this the AIA or whatever, where you just make clear the urgency of keeping the debate alive, without smoothing it out or flattening it or pretending that it's better than it is, that it's just vital.
That's a very optimistic message. That may be. A liveliness that doesn't come to conclusions. And I did also think, Peggy, I wondered how far the architecture lobby had gone outside of the States in its chapters.
There are only chapters in the United States, but we're open.
Yeah. So does your code of whatever have any problem with going global?
Not at all.
No, I didn't think so.
They were present at Venice and inspirational to several of us. And yeah, that's a good idea. We should do that.
So I think that would be a very good step on that front. I think we are coming to the end of our time. So any last voices that would like to be heard? Oh, Marsha.
Say something very quickly, because I've been really thinking about this fascinating point about the relationship between ambition and competition.
And I just want to say, Precarious Workers Brigade is very ambitious.
I think it's about personal ambition versus the ambition of your idea, and it not to be personal ambition, but the idea is more important than yourself.
Well, exactly. So when I talk about, the 3% that my institution nominates as going on to work in the art market, that statement is made out of a place of thinking you're going to be very competitive. We're just telling you the way things are. But what if you actually say, we don't need to accept that. We can reconfigure the conditions in which we're operating through doing things like collectivizing or working cooperatively. And I think the good news for you as students is you're in a context that is extremely supportive of those ways of working. But it's really up to you to self-organize. So to take some responsibility for that learning and practice right now, not waiting for somebody to do it for you, but to do it yourself. So I guess to just really underscore, of course, collectivity, cooperation, collaboration, these terms are fraught. But I still think that this emphasis on self-organization is now more crucial than ever because nobody's going to do it for us. We have to do it ourselves.
So go and self-organize, but still get it out of you.
Yeah, that's a wonderful collection of urgencies to end on. I think if we've got no other questions, it's just my job to really say thank you to all of the speakers. If we go back in line, let's do the speakers first. There's Carol and Leisure, who came all the way from Sao Paulo, and beautiful book is out there. So anybody who has missed yet their launch, please take a book. There's a copy for everybody who's attended. Also to Adam Casa, I think he's still here, and also to Concrete Action, Sib and Charlotte on Friday. And thanks to Alex for chairing that. Thanks this morning to Kadambari and Laura from Who Builds Your Architecture. Wonderfully rich set of researches. And after that, Precarious Workers Brigade. Sophie and Marsha, thank you very much for your contribution, and Shumi as well. And finally, obviously, to Brendan Cormier for chairing that, and finally to Peggy and Jeremy and our invisible Reinier, who nevertheless did provoke us, so we missed his presence. And small details of thanks, maybe, but actually very big. So we all know that Siobhan has got her due. Few citations there as well. Siobhan is fantastic organizer. She probably does overwork, but we try and make sure that we pay her amply for what she does. Wonderful addition to our programme and driving force behind our fundamentals. Fantastic for students to have come, and for guests who paid or who came as guests of speakers. Really, really happy that you all made it against all the odds with all the weather. And
thank you for staying. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Really.
It's good.
And thanks to Mel.
Yes, and thanks to Mel.